what I try to show is in this Life and Death of Democracy project, which I hope will be translated into many world languages because it is a book, so to say, for the world, is that it was in the world of Islam that not only were these early assemblies kept alive, the mosque, and for example, the custom of kusas, of discourses in the mosque. I mean, this is part of an old tradition of the East that was nurtured, kept alive by the world of Islam. But Islam also added new inventions, the waqf, the endowment, the institution, turuk, the institutions of the world of Sufis, the development of al-Madani Jama'iyya, the phenomenon of a kind of civil society, of non-governmental institutions that serve as a brake on concentrated power. The importance of law, of the ulama, a body of jurists, specialists in law who are not playthings of governmental power. And of course, the early experiments with shura, with consultation, the attempt to find institutional forms by which power could be controlled. I mean, all of this has to be part of the history of democracy because it played an essential bridging role between that world of the Mesopotamians and the Phoenicians and the Greeks and the European world, where experiments in power sharing, in the birth of representative democracy, come much later. I should also say one other thing about the very language of democracy in the world of Islam. Professor Dunn has claimed that there was no recognition given to this word. This is factually incorrect. And it's clear, for example, that in the work of Al-Farabi, the great scholar who died approximately 950, about whom we don't know enough, whose life still rather shrouded in mystery, who may have been killed on the road from Damascus by a mugger. This man was responsible for introducing into the world of Arabic, in translation, and with his own discourses, a strong, fresh, new understanding of democracy. And although Al-Farabi, born in Turkestan, had misgivings, particularly in his earlier writings, the mature Al-Farabi drew the conclusion that one of the good and irreplaceable things about democracy, understood as assembly-based government, is that it enabled good leaders to rise, that the cream, as he put it, could come to the surface of the milk. And this is in the year 950, before the year 950, well before in Europe there had been a revival of interest in this old Eastern language of Demokratia. So this is all to say that the whole picture of the past that is part of contemporary democracies, particularly in the West, I mean, that story needs to be changed. And in my own work, I think of this as rather like extending a vote to the dead. You know, democracy among the living requires democracy among the dead. Giving a voice, giving a vote, so to say, to those who have been silenced, pushed aside, forgotten.
Well, being fair to them.
Being unjust to them, yes. And there's no doubt that great violence, I mean literally and symbolically, has been done to these much more complicated roots of what came to be called democracy.
It is no wonder that today a number of renowned Islamic political writers and thinkers like Rashid al-Ghamnouchi, Tawfiq al-Shawi, Hassan Turabi, several others, make the link. Actually, they draw the bridge between the Islamic civilization that had established many of these institutions, that established the rule of law, equality before the law, that protected the community or the citizen from the power of government, to the representative democracy, which we saw later appear in Europe through the writings, for instance, of Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and others. And therefore, unlike the attitude of some people who would write the timeline where there is a huge void between the Greeks and the Renaissance in Europe, the bridge is very fairly written.
I think that's right. And the question today, it is in a way a question of what is called ijtihad. The question is how to make sense of this past legacy of institutions and ways of thinking, jokes even. I mean, the contemporary joke that I have heard from some Muslims, that God, when he gave envy to the world, gave 2% to human beings and 98% to politicians and to clergymen. I mean, this spirit of self-government, this spirit of controlling the exercise of power is rich and deep, and its retrieval, so to say, today is very important. I think that in various parts of the world, whether it be in the world of the so-called Middle East or in East Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, the problem is in matters of the control publicly of power and the prevention of injustice and the struggle for equality, for freedoms. The problem is how to become more aware of past traditions, of trying to bring them, so to say, back to life, the best parts of them, to make them live and useful in the present with an eye on the future. And this is not just a matter, I think, of quoting from scripture or from the hadith in the case of Islam. This is important, but an awareness of institutions, of institutional customs, ways of being in the world. I mean, a retrieval of those, an awareness of those, and a retrieval of those for contemporary politics is very important. That's why it seems to me the story, the history of democracy cannot be silent about this classical past, this period of assemblies. They were a remarkable invention because they put on the table the possibility that flesh and blood, men and women, mere mortals, could decide for themselves how they could live on the face of the earth. Not gods, small g, would decide this, not nature, not despots and tyrants in various forms, but mere mortals, humble people. This, I think, was the great breakthrough in the first phase of the history of democracy, which happened in the East. It is an East. God exists.
I'd like to talk to you more about this in a short while. Professor John Keane, one of the main criticisms addressed to democracy in its second phase, where we saw the emergence of representative democracy in Europe, that within the European entities there was so much interest in improving governance, in protecting the rights of individuals, securing civil liberties, while outside those entities, the governments that were in charge were actually attacking, colonizing, and pillaging other cultures and other nations, destroying them and robbing them of their resources. Was that not a true representation of what was going on?
That certainly happened, but it's a pretty complicated story. It's true that by around 1100 CE, the epicenter, the focus geographically on the face of the earth of the invention of new institutions that would later be called democracy, representative democracy, a term from the 18th century, is Europe. And it begins with the invention of parliamentary representative assemblies. It happens first in northern Spain, and it's a very ironic or sad process, however you see it. The whole idea that a form of government could be invented that would stretch across vast territory, unlike the local assemblies of the ancient world, and the whole idea that you could govern and control power through representatives. This is an invention of first in 1188 in Leon, in northern Spain, by a young king, Alfonso IX, 17 years old, who is aware enough to see that he needs to draw together a convention of nobility, of churchmen, and of town citizens who have money, in order to put together a campaign, a military campaign, to reconquer the lands which, for him and others, are considered rightfully Christian from. And so there you have it, beginning with this basic institution of representative parliaments. You have this dialectic of power sharing, the invention of something new. It would later come to be a central part of what we call representative democracy. But its dark side was conquest, the extension of power over others. And so many of the institutions of representative democracy have been plagued by that dialectic, so to say. But nevertheless, however we judge it, the fact is that it was in what came to be called Europe that a whole constellation, a cluster of institutions was invented, that by the 18th century came to be called representative democracy. Nobody knows who first used that term. It is a Anglo-French American invention. It's an invention of the Atlantic region.
It was started in America and then in France.
Well, that's when the language, the term is born, but the institutions were much older. They were invented much earlier. They include, so by the 18th century, when politicians, constitution makers, and others, writers refer to this new invention of representative democracy, they mean territorial states in which there is the rule of law, in which there are parliaments, there are periodic elections, parties come later, but there is the first intimation that parties are an important part of this component, and that the elections are fair, and that the franchise should be extended. In the 18th century, more than 90% of the populations of Europe are excluded from governmental power. They're not part of this process of representative government and the attempt to democratize it. That process begins sometime between the American and the French revolutions and is given a huge boost by this dramatic uprising that came to be called the French Revolution, and which meant that from there on common men and women could not be excluded from power. There was no justification for this, and so the struggle for equalization of the franchise, the right to be part of the representative system, began.